We have been seriously misled, I believe, because we have depended on that aspect of our brains that is most adept at manipulating the world in order to bend it to our purposes. The brain is, importantly, divided into two hemispheres. You could say, to sum up, a vastly complex matter in a phrase, that the brain's left hemisphere is designed to help us apprehend and thus manipulate the world, the right hemisphere to comprehend it, see it for what it is. The problem is that the very brain mechanisms which succeed in simplifying the world so as to subject it to our control militate against a true understanding of it. Meanwhile, compounding the problem, we take the success we have in manipulating it as proof that we understand it. But that is a logical error. To exert power over something requires us only to know what happens when we pull the levers, press the button, or utter the spell. The fallacy is memorialized in the myth of the sorcerer's apprentice. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that while we have succeeded in coercing the world to our will, to an extent unimaginable even a few generations ago, we have, at the same time, wrought havoc on that world precisely because we have not understood it. I believe that nowadays we live no longer in the presence of the world, but rather in a representation of it. The significance of that is that the left hemisphere's task is to represent what first presents us to the right hemisphere. This representation has all the qualities of a virtual image, an infinitely thin, immobile fragment of a vast, seamless, living, ever-flowing whole. From a standpoint within the representation, everything is reversed. Instead of seeing what is truly present as primary, and the representation as a necessarily diminished derivative of it, we see reality as merely a special case of our representation, one in which something is added in to animate it. True, we can deceive ourselves by mistaking our own projections for reality, and we often do, but that does not entail that we are always victims of self-deception. When we are properly attentive, what we experience is the real deal, though it be only a tiny part of all that is. To appreciate that, you need the right hemisphere, and preferably, of course, both hemispheres, to be in play. It is true that we can see the world only partially, but we still each see the world directly. It is not a representation, but a real presence. There is not a wall between us and the world. Our experience is of whatever it is and not another thing, even if we can't get away from the fact that it is we who experience it. Be free of any algorithm, yet not at all random, is characteristic of the understanding of the right hemisphere. We can specify what is not jazz, but not what is. Our knowledge of anything unique is similarly apophatic. just as and is not merely additive, not is not merely negative. Both are creative. Indeed, resistance, notness, is an absolute necessity for creation. Another apparent paradox, that of which I have no inkling. Whatever I just don't get or see does not exist for me. That manifestation of whatever it is simply not available in my world. But this doesn't mean that things come and go from everyone else's reality, dependent on my understanding of it. Once again, the whole illuminates the parts, as much as the parts can illuminate the whole. To the left hemisphere, you find the truth about something by building it up from bits. But, as the right hemisphere is aware, to understand it, you need to experience it as a whole, since the whole reveals as much about the nature of the parts as the parts do about the nature of the whole. This clarification was necessary because I will be explaining that the world we experience, which is the only one we can know, is affected by the kind of attention we pay to it. This implies that there is no simple and single, wholly, mind-independent truth. In birds and other animals studied, there is a highly significant separation of attention, with the left hemisphere being used largely for paying narrow-beam, sharply focused attention to the world for the purpose of manipulation, and the right hemisphere for paying open, sustained, vigilant attention to the world in order to understand and relate to the bigger picture. The right is also the hemisphere with which creatures approach, appraise, and ultimately bond with their mates. At this stage, I should point out to a reader new to the area that the right half of the brain controls and responds to the left half of the body, and vice versa. That means that motor and sensory function, as well as all manner of perception, except only for the sense of smell, from one half of space, both internal and external, is related to the opposite side of the body. When it comes to the visual field, once again, in most animals, the left eye straightforwardly feeds information to the right hemisphere, and vice versa, where the eyes are on the sides of the head. However, in humans the situation is slightly different, since we have eyes on the front of our heads. That means that the left visual field of each eye, both right and left, feeds to the right hemisphere, and, of course, the right visual field of each eye feeds to the left hemisphere. The detail is not the important thing to remember. The point is that, very broadly, the right hemisphere tends to the left half of the world. The right hemisphere is not just vigilant in a somewhat passive way, it is constantly engaged in both sustaining coherence in the world and actively scanning the world. What may in some cases later become a target for the left hemisphere's narrow focus will most probably have been first detected by the right hemisphere's broad search, though as the seconds pass, there is a tendency to shift towards more focal investigation of details initially revealed by the right hemisphere's overview, thus greater left hemisphere involvement. The search never becomes lateralized to the left. What if our right hemisphere can more readily detect, it were not an essentially lifeless assemblage of things, but a constantly self-creating process. What if imagination was essential to the process of understanding, including, importantly, scientific understanding? Before we move on, let me clear one misconception out of the way at this stage. I'm aware that a hemisphere on its own cannot properly be said to do what only a person can do: believe, intend, decide, like, and so on. A person relying on the faculties of the left or right hemisphere believes, intends, decides, likes, etc. You are not your brain. You are a living human being, as philosopher of neuroscience Alva Noe emphasizes. The idea that a person is a functioning assembly of brain cells and associated molecules is not something neuroscience has discovered. It is rather something it takes for granted, and it shouldn't. There is an excess of confidence and a lack of insight. This vault is useful for purposes of manipulation, but is not a helpful guide to understanding the nature of what it encounters. Its use is local and for the short term. In the other, the right hemisphere version, as in the world the map represents, and in the world revealed to us by physics, by poetry, and simply by the business of living, things are almost infinitely more complex. Nothing is clearly the same as anything else. All is flowing and changing, provisional and complexly interconnected with everything else. Nothing is ever static, detached from our awareness of it, or disembodied, and everything needs to be understood in context, where, if it is not to be denatured, it must remain implicit. Meaning that lies beyond the banality of the familiar and everyday. It is an animate universe and a bureaucrat's nightmare. This is a world from which we cannot detach ourselves, since we are part of it and affected by our relationship with it. The overall timbre is sober and tentative. This world is truer to what is, but is harder to comprehend and to express in language, and less useful for practical issues that are local and short-term. On the other hand, for a broader or long-term understanding, the right hemisphere is essential. The left hemisphere, indeed, is simplistic and therefore far easier to articulate. It sees matters as black and white, either or. The right hemisphere sees the nuances, as well as that we often must embrace two superficially incompatible truths in a both and one. Moreover, that includes embracing both its own take and that of the left hemisphere. Altogether, a far harder and more complex view to articulate. There are plenty of examples, particularly vivid in the case of split-brain patients, but often seen in more common situations such as stroke, in which the left hemisphere not only clearly does not know what it is talking about, but behaves as though it knows perfectly well. Its manner is confident and unhesitating, even when it is talking about something of which it knows absolutely nothing. By contrast, the right hemisphere tends to be hesitant, tentative and flexible, even when it is entirely right. There are a number of reasons for this. The left hemisphere is aware of much less of what surrounds it, sees less, in all senses, than the right. It is less tolerant of ambiguity and tends towards exclusive either-or thinking. The right hemisphere is more inclusive, inclined to both-and thinking. This is imagined in the relationship of the two hemispheres. The right hemisphere communicates more and more quickly with the left hemisphere than the left hemisphere does with the right. And the left hemisphere communicates more within itself, while there are more bilateral interactions between hemispheres for the right hemisphere. The phenomenological world of the left hemisphere is more self-directed, enclosed, self-validating, in thrall to its theory. The world of the right hemisphere, more open. As an example, a lot of effort has been, and continues to be, directed at disentangling what is that the right hemisphere is contributing when we say it is good at understanding metaphor. Is it its affinity for novelty, for complexity, for the implicit, for understanding utterances in context, or for seeing the connection between superficially unrelated elements? Which causes that? This is a little like asking what explains the cat's success in catching mice. Its swiftness, its agility, its visual acuity, the sharpness of its claws, its habit of going out hunting at night. Which is the primary quality? This is the typical left hemisphere approach. If we can only break it up into bits, we will finally understand it by stringing the bits together in the right order. In general, the right hemisphere communicates both more and more quickly with the left hemisphere than the left hemisphere does with the right. This is exactly what one would expect if the right hemisphere is superior in perception and more aware of what is going on. It's more urgent than the left hemisphere learn from the right, than that the right hemisphere learn from the left. However, it is not that the right hemisphere relatively neglects internal communication compared with the left. The right hemisphere is both more mutual and better integrated within itself. It has repeatedly been shown that in the resting state of the normal brain, there is in general greater connectivity and coherence in the right hemisphere, both greater integration of information within the hemisphere, and a greater degree of hemispheric transfer.